Here we are in room number 2 and we have a workshop by Helen Sanson. The title of the workshop is Invisible: How Systems Thinking Contributes to the Marginalization of Global Majority Women. Helen is the director of Coursera CIC, a not for profit education and business consultancy offering systems thinking expertise built on a good understanding of the various practices for systems change for social impact, while also appreciating the practical challenges faced when doing so. Her specialities include governance, exclusions, diversity and inclusion, intersectionality and policy, assessment, curriculum and resource development, careers and work related learning, capacity building and leadership, and fundraising. Over to you, Helen. We shall try to wrap up the workshop before 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so this was the original title when I submitted my proposal. However, I've subsequently changed it because firstly, this did not convey my intentions. And secondly, I wouldn't like to say I like the word marginalized, and I've no idea why I used it. I'm not fond of this word because it has power to keep you in place and how marginalization is decided. In systems thinking, at least in boundary technique, we're asked to explore and explain marginalization. Yet most of the time this doesn't happen. It is assumed that people who are not from the majority group must be marginalized, or if they come from a certain race or class or culture. However, as systems thinkers, we know that's not as simple as that. Conversations that attempt to address challenge to problematic words and their origins use and impact and create and maintain power and privilege are often missing. I wanted to change it as my talk is about empowerment. I felt it was very negative, but unfortunately it didn't get also on the publicity. And I just wanted to explain why I chose the term global majority woman, as it may not be familiar to you. White European people represent about 20% of the global population, and the other 80% are global majority people. Understanding this singular truth may shift the dial, and it should certainly permanently disrupt and relocate the conversation on race and racism. The global majority is a collective term coined by Rosemary Campbell-Stevens in 2009, and she states that it first and foremost speaks to and encourages us to think of ourselves as belonging to the majority on planet Earth. It refers to people who are Black, African, Asian, Brown, Indigenous, and so on, who have been racialized as ethnic and ethnic minorities. All too often we're referred to through acronyms such as BAME, which is Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, or POC, People of Color, or Minoritized. These are lazy, clumsy, blunt, and almost universally reviled by those who they describe. They also homogenize us, and there's no reference to specific backgrounds to represent individuals or groups, whereas the global majority does not eradicate distinct identities. It does, however, have the potential to connect and amplify the voices of the majority. People started to use these terms as a form of empowerment to bring about people together and mobilize different racialized groups towards common goals. However, each of them still situates whiteness as a norm and an undeniable truth for most people on this planet. These labels only serve to delegitimize our right to self-identity, or even be on our terms. These terms say more about the attitude of those who use them towards us, but what does it say about us for allowing them? So this is the new title, and I feel it encaptures the energy and lens I had in mind when I first put forward my proposal. So what this workshop will be doing is what's in the objectives here on the slide. So it's really going to be looking at feminist systems thinking framework and how it can be used to consider the global majority of women's lives. And also it's a challenge to current ways of seeing it through systems thinking. And so basically it's going to reconceptualize its systems thinking methods and practices, and it actually helps uplift the global majority of women's voices. By the end of this workshop, and I'm hoping we'll be able to use the breakout rooms. I'm not a techno person with a Zoom, so hopefully we will be able to, because I think there's at least 50 of you. So there's an overview of feminist systems thinking. There's a positioning of global majority in systems thinking and how the feminist systems thinking framework can be used in practice. So I'll be going over the position of women's systems thinking, feminist systems thinking framework, feminist systems thinking framework in practice, and then a critique of the framework. So we've got the chat function open. So please, if you can, write up who you are, your name, etc. A little about yourselves, because I'm sure you'll be wondering who's in the room. I know I am, even though at the moment I can't really see anything apart from my slides. But please do feel free to post anything in there about yourselves. So the first bit I'd like to talk about is the position of women in systems thinking. So a little bit of history. So in the late 19th century, when many Western formal studies became academic disciplines, they were the exclusive province of men. Seminars were male arenas where discussions led by and in the interests of males prevailed. Like many intellectual traditions, Western systems thinking is generally practiced and written by those with power. It is the perspective not of the oppressed or the needy, but of those who have access to education, which are often men. Systems thinking has mainly co-opted by engineering, business, and technology. Men have provided the leadership here. They have written systems that amplify their voices to justify the acquisition of power. Thus, systems thinking is a vehicle of the powerful, written to support individual organizations and parties as a device to provoke their vision. There is no value-free academic study as it is driven by political and economic interests and will take on the position of privileged groups in society, which then reinforces and upholds their status quo and voice. Systems thinking practitioners have more social and economic privilege and power than those who they focus on, as they can control to a large extent the procedures and processes and findings and how these are evaluated and in turn represented to others, which are often masculine in tone. In addition, the use of specific jargon, terminology, and logic serves a powerful barrier to ensure systems thinking, like other academic traditions, are locked in and accessible to only those with a high level of knowledge. Systems thinking tries to reach objectivity by reading the written sources on the subject that are being preserved and handed down. But think about it, what's being kept and handed down? Western systems thinking was born of an academic tradition governed by men. As a result, men have dominated the practice, and the work that has been deemed important enough to study is by men. With this backdrop, it's no wonder why women have been missing in the academic study and practice. However, we are there. Women in systems literature and practice tend to be subsumed into the general male gaze of the power structures, as we are implicitly tied rather than explicitly tied to systems. However, women as a collective have a very different experiences from each other. When are we included? Which women's voices are heard? How does this inclusion affect the outcomes of systems, as women are not a homogeneous group and we are also not all equal? Although inequalities are complex problems and are debated extensively in many spheres within systems thinking, it only accounts for a small number of works, despite systems methods being used extensively to analyze and improve social and organizational systems where inequalities are embedded. This is because most of the literature that forms the basis of systems thinking has been written mainly by white privileged educated men who have unwittingly overlooked that inequalities are ingrained into systems. When they identify and discuss and create solutions to social and organizational problems, it is often without regard for or input from women. Therefore, these problems are shaped through a male lens. In the words of Vickers, a trap is only for creatures that cannot solve problems it sets. Men traps are dangerous only in relation to the limitations of what men can see and values and do. Thus, systems thinking has provided little literature on building an equitable world that works for everyone. What has further stifled systems thinking to address issues of inequality is that despite some schools of thought calling for emancipation from systems, the majority of methods advocate for improvement to systems, and this over the past 3 decades has become the dominant position. The problem being, in the words of Midgley, that it is a general commitment to improvement that does nothing to encourage people to challenge the automatic prioritization of human boundaries in systems practice. Moreover, as systems thinking is carved from the lens of men, so too the improvement it calls for, which again will further embed imbalances as they are based on the perceptions and assumptions shaped by their biases, cultures, beliefs, and values. Therefore, as women's voices are generally missing from systems practice, these improvements are more likely to disempower us, since we are not there to ensure our interests are being met, as global majority women are least likely to figure our disenfranchisement will be worse. Over recent years, systems thinking has increasingly adopted systemic inquiry practices, which require co-design by including as many diverse stakeholders as possible. When trying to make these improvements, unfortunately, there is still not, it's not the same as emancipation. All too often, the co-creators' voices are diluted or disappear during the design and implementation or evaluation phases. If they threaten the status quo of the patriarchal orthodoxy, are often jettisoned.
Helen, I'm sorry to interrupt. Okay.
Yep.
If you are trying to change the slides, we could
No.
only see the last. Okay, thank you. Now it changed.
Sorry, yeah, they don't change that often. Co-creation has become the dominant approach to advocate for change in systems thinking. However, even when it purports to see connections, it sees complex problems as discrete and specific. It does this through artificial distinctions, conflating agendas and exclusion. This leads to ineffective, simple, one-size-all-fits solutions, especially for women. One of the reasons, as discussed, is its predominantly white, Western and male gaze form of systems thinking. The other is it lacks the adoption of other relevant social sciences, politics and perspectives, such as feminism, to understand the world's complexity. This failure has not served global majority women well. To understand how global majority women are omitted from both structures and systems in society and academic practices of systems thinking, a valuable theory to turn to is intersectionality. In 1989, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality to argue for a broader definition of what it means to be a woman through the lens of race and sex discrimination. Crenshaw argued that the court's narrow view of discrimination exemplifies the conceptual limits of a single lens analysis, which echoes what is often problematic with systems thinking. Crenshaw noticed how white women can represent all women and all global majority women, and therefore are no different. Global majority men can represent the concept of men and global majority women and are no different from them, but are different from white men. By default, white men can represent all women and men and are no different from anyone, which is a position adopted in many systems thinking work. Yet global majority women represent no one. Therefore, a global majority of women's distinct differences and experience are buried under white women, global majority men, and white men. Thus, white women and global majority women function in opposition that fails to acknowledge their slippages and realities. Then, in addition, global majority women are simultaneously seen as oppressed and disenfranchised, while at the same time being locked into gender ideologies that see us as stoic and strong due to this dualism. For systems thinking, we have to push to consider what it means to tell us about the experiences of global majority women by asking what can be uncovered about us in systems. For example, how do we in specific systems adapt? How does this shape our experiences? In other disciplines, these questions are increasingly being answered, yet through boundary technique. Although it explains marginalisation, explores it in systems thinking, it does not go far enough to interrogate the intersections of different groups of women in the broader range of the population. Systems thinking could adopt other relevant social sciences, politicals and perspectives to pick apart women's complexity in systems so we can think differently about how we're situated. So I don't know how the breakouts work, but I was asked if we could just do short 5-minute ones if we can, or just less, just so you can have a little break and think about what I'm saying. Or if you want to just do it in the chat, I don't mind, but this is what I wanted you to think about. So here are some starter questions to get you thinking about what I've just said. Why is there a lack of global majority women system thinkers and practitioners? And why is it essential for global majority women to be seen in systems and for systems thinking practice to listen to us? As I have no idea how things are working on here, I would say that to put it into the chat and then we can discuss it afterwards. Hopefully we should have some time to discuss it, and I'll just move on to the next part of the my presentation. Okay. So the next part is, what is the feminist systems thinking framework? So feminist systems thinking is a new and evolving socio-political and theoretical framework and has been predominantly developed by Anne Stevens, and she's from Australia. It critically addresses sexual and gender oppression through systems thinking by placing women's voices at the centre. Furthermore, it can consider the intersectional nature of oppression through mixed methods and practices. Although there have been advances for women, collectively our voices are still on the fringes. For global majority of women, when we are seen through the lenses of race and class, our visibility decreases in society and through forms of feminism. For global majority of women, the feminist systems thinking framework has the potential to offer new insights that lead to a more complex and nuanced understanding of our lives. The feminist systems thinking framework results from Western academic practices of systems thinking being male on orientation in terms of theorists and gaze, as its lens is man and nature of the systems. Stevens noticed that neither the female presence nor feminism were addressed in most mainstream systems thinking works. There has been an unease about the lack of a female lens in the space, even amongst male practitioners. This has led women to be excluded from systems thinking literature, theory, and practice. Barbara Hanson said it has led to systems thinking being embedded with sexist or conservative ideologies. Stevenson chose cultural ecofeminism as a way to address this, as it draws on sex and gender to analyze the relationships between women and the natural world. Stevenson felt ecofeminism acknowledged the dual oppression of women and the environment. Furthermore, she believed it could combine grounded and critical systems theory similarities. They both seek to critically tackle issues of power and coercion through awareness and emancipation, using various methods to address issues. Stevenson said that systems and structures of oppression interlock and reinforce one another. Therefore, ecofeminism positions humanity as integral part of the physical environment. Reductionist and separation of human systems from the physical environment perpetuate cultural constructed oppressive dualism. The binary constructs of man, culture, women, and nature have their roots in the logic of value-free science and fails to acknowledge for or give voice to members of the underside of the dualism, such as women and the environment. So there's five principles of the feminist systems thinking framework that Stevenson proposed in the depicted model, and they all have equal weighting and are based upon some of the criteria of systemic intervention and cultural ecofeminism. The principles which I'm going to discuss in a moment are being gender sensitive, value the voices from the margins, center nature, select appropriate methodologies, and bringing about social change. These principles make us aware of the critical issues around sex, gender, ecological justice, and their role in connecting to caring for the environment. The principles orientate towards enabling us to discover for ourselves through qualitative methods, long-term relationships between people, community, and environment. The feminist systems thinking framework values the process of knowledge generation through action and practice, which is relevant and can be used in diverse community contexts. As the five principles all have equal importance, any aspect can be marginalized, as it's down to the project designers to decide the weight given to each. However, systemic inquiry should overcome this through stakeholder dialogue, as they can determine the relevance, importance, and priority of each. So gender describes those characteristics that socially determine women and the economic, social, political, and cultural attributes and opportunities associated with being a woman. In most societies today, men and women differ in their activities, access to and control of resources, and participation in decision-making, as women commonly have less access to opportunities. Stevenson's idea of gender sensitivity, or paying attention to specific gendered needs, is to equally encompass women's needs throughout a project, from design to evaluation, as you would consciously or consciously with a man's. Gender sensitivity is a vital consideration to help us present us from overlooking what is distinctive about a woman's experiences. Forrest said it can implicitly assume that women's experiences are either unimportant or parallel to men. Despite feminism emerging and being established as a distinct analytical discourse to understand women's needs and wants and to be visible in narratives, systems thinking has overlooked or doubted the need to include women's voices, rather than appreciating and evaluating women's as different from men, we all too often have become add-ons to their stories with no nuanced integration. As such, the outcomes for women have reinforced their existing inequalities. Gender sensitivity is a way of identifying, understanding, and incorporating gender implications in the design and process and procedures, exploring the impact of findings and advocating for change based on those findings. It also asks for an examination of issues that impact gender from the outset of any project that people may be aware of, as conscious or unconscious bias has wider implications. That said, gender sensitivity has to be used discerningly because, as Plumwood noticed, non-gender specific language conceals oppression when the underlying imbalances of power and influence are not addressed. Furthermore, acknowledging the distinguishing features of a woman's experience does not mean they have been intended to. Women are exposed to social, economic, and environmental issues in distinctive ways, and their experiences need to be contextualized in relation to their situatedness. So Plumwood stated that masculine feminine dualism is significantly prevalent in many cultures and societies, effectively silences and subordinates women. As such, Stevenson asks us through the feminist system thinking framework to contextualize projects by paying attention to marginalized powerless groups and the integration of oppressions, while also respecting the social, cultural, racial, ethnic, and economic and historical experiences of women. Combined with gender sensitivity, which we just looked at, Stevens shows this is a meaningful way to acknowledge the intersections of people's cultural experiences. It also helps commit to the moral imperative to challenge the damaging assumptions that there is a clear-cut separation between who we are and what we think to reduce the biases that come from current and historical social privileges. Gender is structured within different patriarchies in complex, multiple ways that intertwine with other social orders. According to Hart, this is intrinsic to the formation and changes within the categories of class, race, and caste. Western patriarchy interrelates with neoliberalism and impacts most of the world's powerless people, i.e. women. Stevens noticed that patriarchal practices are deeply embedded in, shaped by, and interrelated with multiple societal contracts that are marginalized women in other groups in policy, economic, faith, legal, and cultural paradigms. This exclusionary practice applies to both humans and non-humans, e.g. animals or plants, recognizing that both warrant equal respect, moral inclusion, and that their political voice needs to be represented. So Western thought maintains a false distance between humans and nature by rejecting and denying humans' links to animals and the environment, e.g. our emotions, senses, and agency. The archetypal ideal human aspires to mastery over animals and the environment. So according to Stevens, the human-centric nature of systems thinking needs to be reviewed so that interwoven and intrinsically connect oppressive states can be addressed through the political engagement of the non-human realm. Goodchild said we need to know if change is beneficial or harmful to all facets of the system, not just to humans, but to nature, including animals and the environment. This has to be considered so we understand how change affects the more comprehensive worldview, as it's only then that we can see the trajectory of change. Rather than seeing an arbitrary divide between nature and people, Stevens sees centering nature as making visible political dimensions achieved by seeking to expose where traditional philosophical categories are built on the exclusion of women, nature, and subordinated others. Stevenson claims that we are deluded into thinking that humans are somehow separate and are not dependent on nature by neglecting to do so. The definition of nature can either be expanded, or people can choose to reject much of human science or social systems for an alternative lifestyle to the natural environment of choice. A difficulty, according to Stevens, arises when humans attempt not to distinguish the boundaries between human and nature, focusing only on sameness rather than difference. If we elect to extinguish or non-distinguish these boundaries, the effect will be a blurring by a subsumption by one dominant system according to identity and character. Stevenson recommends that we transcend binary relationships and reevaluate and recast nature as something worthy of respecting its difference from the human. Brown states that non-human concerns can be analysed, incorporating a moral philosophy that reevaluates and reintegrates what rationalist culture has split apart, denied, and devalued. Plumwood proposes that human connection to nature and place is through a continuity between genuine human virtues and nature, and can be seen in some cultures' relationship with nature. A reconceptualization of the self allows us to find a place for emotion, subjectivity, particularity, and animality in moral philosophy. Mallory contends that the political is not limited to the human. The more than human world is too capable of political agency, action, or speech, and can assert claims that human beings are capable of recognizing. Understanding the voices of non-human realm lies in humans recognizing that non-humans are present on the margins and are often active participants in shared and co-constituted value experiences. Man offers an approach to building a politics that acknowledges the independencies between people and ecological places. Freedom is conditional upon one's location in an eco-social world and not freedom from the realm of nature in the rationalist fashion. Man urges humans to think about their dependency upon the planet and see one's relationship to its political question. She suggests that human relationships with nature entail a fundamental obligation to protect and support it. This aspect is where cultural ecofeminism and critical systems theory similarities emerge. They both believe that there is a need to use tailored and responsive methods to address messy problems. Stevenson states effective methodology selection entails both choices and responsibilities, as there are a moral responsibility if its methods are selected, bringing conflicted viewpoints together. She sees this as the only way to deal with adequately with multiple diverse people and the context, as it requires a commitment to communication and critical reflection. However, it's not a superficial approach. Stevenson states that we face a choice of standpoint to work with a theory and defend it, or to work with multiple theories, each of which particularly privileges a particular insight. The training and comfort we have with methods and their root paradigms are also essential considerations. Who we are and our previous experience determines our ability to choose and manage mixed methods. As such, those choices must be defended in light of serious consideration of what other approaches may offer. For Stevens, the practice of using an approach from one particular paradigm but operated under the direction of another paradigm is oblique. Methods, tools, and techniques can be applied to paradigms other than the one informing their development or with which they are customarily associated, moving across hard and soft paradigms involving learning and unlearning new rules in a process that resembles acquiring a second language and culture. However, Stevenson takes a cautious approach when dealing with problematic situations requiring intervention. She advocates boundary critique to identify the depth and breadth of issues and the inclusion and exclusion of its stakeholders. Also, she supports the use of discordant pluralism, which critically considers similarities and differences of perspectives to gauge the value of a particular viewpoint. Further, she encouraged transparencies about differences in worldwide views and their potential impact on decisions. The application of feminist systems thinking framework is towards achieving valued social change. Stevenson sees its goal to operate beyond a positive framework, to challenge the divide between man and nature, and to achieve lasting social changes by applying theory in practice. The feminist systems thinking framework committed to political action is strong and extended to political advocacy of those using the framework, which Stevenson says should be done through sustainable methods such as collective decision-making. As she emphasizes the moral issue represented in the decisions made, actions taken or not, and the consequences anticipated or realized, with the ultimate responsibility being at the minimum to cause no harm. Stevenson mentions there should be a desirable and sustainable change through social philosophy that must extend social critique and a utopian visioning into action by engaging in action-orientated methods, which when viewed by those involved, should be appropriate to the circumstances or context of the intervention. Feminist systems thinkers are critical of those who, as Bryden says, rail against injustice, but only from the protected rooms of the academy and the quiet pages of journals. There must be a solid action focus which addresses industrial organizational, social, community, and environmental issues, and sustainable development. Yet a significant challenge is developing methods capable of dealing with this level of complexity and uncertainty. Therefore, stakeholders must resolve actions through a dynamic systems intervention process. The answers will be grounded within the context of their unique sets of issues or concerns and provide a space where subjectivity can be formed, contested, destabilized, and reformed as a democratic process. Therefore, the feminist systems thinking framework attempts to be holistic by incorporating practices that involve questioning the purpose of research and includes multiple stakeholders by defining problems, drawing upon mixing multiple methods and embracing environmental issues alongside social ones. So again, there's things I want you to think about, and what I've just said is, what are your initial thoughts of this feminist systems thinking framework? It is quite new, it's still being developed, but it is still drawing upon traditional systems thinking methods. So is it a great change? And to what extent do you think it's overcome the male-centric lens of traditional systems thinking? And again, we can go back over this at the end when I've finished. So this is it in practice, and these 2 bits are quite short, so forgive me for, I know I'm talking a lot, but we will have time to discuss all this at the end. So feminist systems thinking is a framework whose principles and guidelines are indicators rather than a theoretical position. There are no right or wrong ways to use it, so it is adaptable to the context you're working in. One of the root causes at the center of systemic inequalities is it's far easier to make problems someone else's rather than seeing them as part of society's structures and systems that we all have to tackle. By using other relevant social sciences, political perspectives, and feminist systems thinking framework can build a shared vision where the global majority of women feels like they belong to the collective one. But unfortunately, many global majority of women do not feel they can shape their future as part of a shared vision because we're often not given a chance to belong. As a result, we don't see how we can fit in and contribute, or worse, why we should, as a vision is not part of our lived reality, experiences, perspectives. Suppose this feminist systems thinking framework is used holistically. In that case, it can ask those trying to change systems to critically analyze their role and those affected by it, such as the global majority of women. It can ensure they feel that they belong to the change process, but most importantly, not through the lens of being other to the system, but being part of the whole. This means building and maintaining global majority of women's trust in the system by repairing any fractures that have been caused by othering, which has led them to feel polarized. Thus, we can create solutions and interventions that transform systems by putting in this effort. The goal of the feminist systems thinking framework must be to engage through co-creation with all women, and particularly global majority women that are part of the system, to foster belonging. Yet more importantly, any strategies that are created are based on being aware of the similarities and differences in the situatedness of groups of women and identifying the key obstacles they face, so that co-created goals are aimed to hit one net by incorporating each group's targets. Hence, they all belong to success. Therefore, disparities are not seen through the eyes of one group of women, but all those affected. The result is not to close the disparity or gap for specific women. This only opens them up for another group. The aim is to eliminate the disparity gap for all, so the problem goes away entirely by targeting all women. By creating strategies for each group of women, they all share in the outcomes and feel that they belong. The imperative of the framework is to use design strategies for each group of women's needs and are not global or one size fits all. Women have to access strategies based on an uneven measure of equality because they are situated differently relative to each other due to the social, economic, and environmental factors they face. The framework could help us understand the gains and losses from the system are unequal in their distribution across many attributes, from race to sex, ability to wealth, and the allocation contains bias, all of which affects women's relationship to the system. When creating strategies, this concept needs to be at the forefront of understanding how this occurs and what the opportunity to find leverage points to co-create goals that unite are. This is vital since it shows the structures and systems that affect women's lives have more influence on their outcomes, both positively and negatively, than individual choices. Women do not control these structures and systems that can be physical, social, cultural, political, and economical. Yet their influence on their existence is profound and complex as they affect how women are situated personally and spatially. The framework could allow you to include all women's voices and meet them where they are situated in relation to the social, economic, and environmental factors and how they intersect and overlap, where there are disparities and where there are potential. It could be a powerful way to highlight missed patterns when we see issues from traditional male-orientated systems perspectives. It could also help give greater meaning to women's lived experience, but above all, let us see the positives that are often overlooked in favor of the negatives, so that when coming up with solutions, we can learn from what is working, which is can give us new insights. This way, strategies pull everyone along together as a group with a shared common vision and purpose, so there are benefits for all. It requires an understanding that if you fix the whole system and the disparities it creates, which affect many women, this will impact who suffers from inequalities. When designing strategies, it is crucial to acknowledge all women's common goals whilst addressing the subtle and extreme contrast between different situated groups of women and what opportunities are available. Strategies that want to transform and change systems have to do this so that success is based upon the outcomes for the targeted groups of women. This is far more nuanced of their take of complex systems. It allows to hear stories from different groups of women about how they're impacted and their needs, rather than focusing on our attention on one group of women and seeing them being in more need than others because of their attributes. So again, something to think about here are, how are global majorities of women's voices seen by you in your systems thinking practice? How are you considering their voices within it? And to what extent would the feminist systems framework help you in your practice? Or is it already being practiced like you in this way? Because some of you might be doing forms of systemic practice, particularly in inquiry, which actually does this same thing. But are you still considering global women's voices in the way that Stevenson suggests? So now I'm going on to the critique. And then, like I said, we'll be wrapping up shortly so we can then talk about this. By focusing on the tradition of cultural ecofeminism, like other forms of systems thinking, the feminist systems thinking framework could be exclusive at the expense of other relevant social sciences, politics, and perspectives. However, as Stevenson states, feminist systems thinking is a framework whose principles are guidelines and indicators rather than a theoretical position. However, her call for tailored and responsive methods to address messy problems means that other relevant positions can be co-opted and adapted, especially as ecofeminism concept of dual oppression is sympathetic to most. This would overcome that it doesn't address the axis of power and coercion when dealing with sensitive and traumatic issues of gender and sex. Further, the feminist systems thinking framework derives from a Western white systems thinking lens. As such, there may be limits to the transferability of its principles, especially within different societies and cultures. This is furthered by the terminology, reasoning, and academic jargon it is imbued with, and how this could be adapted to make the framework more accessible. The term feminism is also problematic and has a troubled history in many countries and amongst women. So whether it should be used will depend on many factors. In addition, Stevens states that feminist systems thinking framework was preliminarily a tool for reflection by systems thinking practitioners rather than everyday people. Yet as feminism is about empowering women, it is vital to make it open to all. The broader the range of people who use it, the better quality of reflection about society structures and systems and their consequences for all women will emerge, especially from lived experience perspectives. This would require making it visual and less written, as many women are illiterate and not by choice. Each element of the feminist systems thinking framework is non-hierarchical, as all 5 parts are treated as equally important. As such, gender is not prioritized, and in some contexts where the concept of female emancipation has been subjugated, it may become lost, thus defeating the object of bringing women's voices to the forefront. This flexibility does not lend itself to an in-depth analysis of gender and sex. This is why selecting suitable methods and practice is necessary, as it has to be the foundation to make it relevant, functional, and applicable to the real world. So in conclusion, and then we can go on to discuss this, global majority women need a feminist systems framework to better inform change by centering us in systems. Systems thinking may claim it has much to say about society, but it does tend not to connect its observation overtly to women, let alone global majority women. Incorporating women, particularly global majority women, into systems, feminist systems thinking framework might help us to think about how we imagine a world where we are equal. What does liberation through equality look like if global majority women's voices are part of the emergent futures envisioned through systems thinking? Would we be better able to hold organizations and governments accountable for our situatedness? Additionally, we might reclaim critical female voices in our society who are raised from systems interventions because they inhabit the intersections of race and other identities such as class or disability. Finally, the feminist systems thinking framework can help us look critically at the context of global majority women's lives and our womanhood as an equally powerful force in shaping society systems. By reassessing society through the lens of the global majority woman, the feminist systems thinking framework can better understand the intersections of our lives and find ways to address inequalities. The feminist system thinking framework dislodges the white Western male as the central normative group in systems thinking by establishing the need to examine how gender and nature are situated and how they intersect with other issues. By moving women, especially global majority women, to the center of the framework, new considerations of existing perspectives can emerge and reveal the conversations needed. Global majority women experience, as Crenshaw noticed, intersecting patterns of racism and sexism because of the intersectional identity of both women of color within discourses that are shaped to respond to one another. Women of color are marginalized within both. Unfortunately, systems thinking neglects intersectional impacts and their realities of them. The feminist systems thinking framework gives us a way to correct this and build on the other relevant social sciences, political and perspectives that highlight how systems impact us. Suppose the feminist systems thinking framework adopts more participatory and awareness-based practices that create generative conversations. In that case, it will ultimately serve to position global majority women into systems and towards each other. If systems thinking incorporate other relevant perspectives, such as feminism, more comprehensively and productively, it would confront society's problems that would create more nuanced solutions. Too often, the male dominance of systems thinking subtly undermines us, but we have the power to transform systems, practices, and methods through this framework. If the feminist systems thinking framework can displace the white Western male way of thinking as a norm, global majority women might gain a stronger, more flexible and global relevant framework to critique social and organizational systems. When women, particularly global majority women, are more seriously regarded within systems thinking, both in study and practice, there is an indefinite amount of changes that the feminist system thinking framework can help bring about. So again, what to think about here is what would happen if we created our own systems thinking framework. And although we're emerging a group, global majority women in the systems thinking world, we have not created our own frameworks, methods, and practices. So what would that look like? And then if that was the case, what would the world look like if we could design structures and systems for ourselves in our way, in our shape? So these are the references from today, which you will get shared as well if you want to get them from me. I'm sure that the organizers will pass them on. And so now I'm just open for discussion. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me speak. I know it was a lot to take in, and that's why I've opened this up to a proper discussion so you can question me and ask me any questions you have. Hope you gained something from it. And I'm open to any questions or any debate on this. So thank you. And I'm also going to make me more visible because I can't actually see you all.
Thanks a lot, Helen. Such a wonderful session. I have been noting down so many points, in fact, and there are a couple of them on the chat. Would you like to address them first?
Yep, I'm just going to go up to have a look. So, okay. So thank you. I think the first question, is it because systems thinking is already male dominated, like you already mentioned, and power relations present and the devolution already in power finds resistance? Yes. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's no different from many other academic traditions where it's where they've come from. As I said, the history of academia is from male. Men in lots of countries have been the ones who've been allowed to be educated. So it's going to be a natural part of the system that's where it's come from. But there has been, and particularly since I've been working in the system, a slight resistance and reticence about women's voices, although at the same time it's acknowledged that there needs to be more women's voices, not just as practitioners, but within the methods and methodology and the academic sphere of systems thinking. But yet at the same time, there's a slight resistance. So there's this weird dichotomy that a lot of women face, that we're welcomed and we acknowledge that we need to be more welcomed, but at the same time, there's a slight pushback. But this goes back to what I said, that means that we'd end up challenging the status quo. And if the status quo has been built from a male lens, you don't want the change. It's that uncertainty we talk about in systems coming through, but within our own academic world. The other one is systems itself focus on patriarchy and renaissance, and more involvement of women into the system will only open up new avenues and space for thinking. That's why feminist systems thinking are more critiqued than any other movements. Yes, yeah, exactly. And in fact, this particular framework has been knocking around since around 2000, early 2000s, and really conceptualized around 2010, but yet it's not that well known that it even exists. I think for some of you, it's probably the first you've ever heard that there is a framework that incorporates women and women's lenses, and it's also open to your interpretation, which is nice. It's flexible, so it can be used in various countries, but yet you pick up a book and you're not going to find it anywhere. It's really just a clutch of papers that exists that bring this together. And if you even type in, feminism in systems thinking, it really is just this group of papers that bring it up. And I really hope that by bringing it here today and more people talk about it, that it will become more accepted. But yes, as it goes on, it's going to be more and more critiqued, because that's what happens to, unfortunately, particularly when women come up with something, it does often seem to face more criticism. Do we have any, I mean, people can turn their microphones on if you want to ask me anything, if you want to chat, please do, the floor is open to you.
Yes, in fact, please, you can also raise your hands. I can moderate that. Helen, I have a few questions. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Helen, while we were talking about systems approach to women empowerment, there are already existing bases of connections, organizations of women based on culture, on social roots, which connect very well with nature, especially across India. In many places, we see festivals which are very integrated with culture, and which bring together women of various races. So the intersectionality is very much there, and even at times various different places and different ways of life come together for these things. So is there a way, or what is your take on studying culture as a system for understanding women's empowerment?
Yeah, I totally hear you. That's why I threw in that there, as a critique of this, is that problematic, is that she's Australian and she's a white woman. And this is not new, this idea of nature and people and the connection to each other. And in fact, in most non-Western traditions, it's always been the case that you see this connection between us and nature, and there isn't this division, that we understand that, that we need nature more than it needs us in some respects. And there are many, as you said, cultural practices around the world and in festivals. So I think the problem, I think a lot of people in the Western world think this idea is new, and she's not the only one. There's quite a few books that came out over the last 2 years since the pandemic, particularly, which mix systems thinking with this idea of the natural world and the global voice, etc. But what the stuff it contains is not new. It is stuff that you'll find, particularly the lower, not lower, but if you go into a lot of other cultural spheres and realms, it's been practiced for centuries, but you don't often have a name for it. It's not written down. Some of these things that you're talking about, they're only known by people who live within a certain radius, etc. But they're there, and there are things that we do, but because of history, because of subjugation in some, it's been locked down or been told that it's not a thing. But now it's become a Western thing and capitalized and made good, then it's now a thing. But yeah, they should really come together, because if you want to see how it should really work, you need to go to the people who've been doing it all the time and have been collectively doing it all the time, and give them their voice. Because if this is about empowering voices in some respect, this framework, then you need to go back to the source and say, you need to be risen up and elevated because you've been doing this all the time. We're just putting it down into academic practice and words, but here it is a living embodiment of people coming together from different races, practices, etc., understanding the dualism between people and nature, and here it is in practice, and this is what the outcomes are.
Helen, there's one more trend also with the women self-help groups, where a group of women come together for their social and financial inclusion and security. And it's kind of very prevalent in modern societies, and in a way has been even mentioned by major global institutions as a major path changer, or kind of a new light in terms of financial security of women. What is your take on these?
Yes, and again, I've noticed, and particularly has been highlighted over the role of women, and particularly the financial role of women. I think over the last 2 years with the pandemic, has really been highlighted. That number one, we actually, I over here, I know of quite a few women's groups who have set up, particularly to discuss women in finance and their financial position. That we are both have become a long way, as I said, in the sport. Women across the world have come a long way in some respects, and a lot of us are now in a position that we have more control over our finances and our lives. It's not the case for everybody, and our voices begin to be more amplified around our economic understanding of not just home-based finances, but finances in the financial world. And I think the practices that are coming forward from that, and I know like over here, there's quite a trend about generational wealth in women as well, and how we can control that, needs to come forward, because again, it's this weird thing in systems work that if it's in a book and it's being taught in a lecture, then it's a thing and it's an academic thing. But when people are doing it informally, or they just decided to set up a community of practice to talk about it, it's just a thing that women do. And I think it needs to start being recognized as still a system practice, because if they are changing something for people, and if they're changing the financial position of women, or highlighting how we have changed the financial standing for women in whatever way, whether it's in the home or whether it's within the workplace, then this needs to be recognized as a practice, and it is doing something, it is making some sort of change. It goes back to your first thing, that anything that's on the ground and it's just being done by people collectively is just, it's just them doing their thing. But as soon as someone commits it to an academic paper or structure, then it's accepted, and it's these informal groups and what they're doing and the changes they've made, whether it's about finances, whether it's about other aspects of society. Particularly, again, over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of great work around the domestic abuse and violence. It needs to be recognized, because if they're making a change and if they're thinking about the problem, are they not systems thinkers too? I think they are.
Wonderful, Helen. You and me can go on talking. It's such a wonderful topic. We have one hand raised by Rajalakshmi SA and a few comments on the chat before we come back on a few more questions of mine. So maybe Rajalakshmi, uh, uh, if you can just unmute yourself and go ahead with the question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, thank you. Ma'am, hello, ma'am.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the session, ma'am. This is the first time I'm hearing about feminist system thinking, and it makes a lot of sense actually. Because you talked about how nature and we are one, and how feminism actually relies on nature and things. That makes a lot of sense, ma'am. Thank you so much for that point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think it's really this idea of nature and systems. The person I name check in the work is Melanie Goodchild, who runs, or some of you might know it, the Turtle Island Institute, and she's for a First Nations Canadian academic thinker, and she talks a lot about this connection to nature, and that we need to bring back, because even within the environmentalist group, it's very much like we control nature, when in fact nature controls us. And we've seen this in COVID. COVID came from nature, it's controlled us. We then fell apart in some respect because we can't control it. It is a dominant force. It will be there long after we've disappeared. So we have to respect it, and it has to be part of our lens when we're thinking about systems, because the environment is everything around us. We are environmental in ourselves. And so that connection needs to come back in. And I think, not disparaging men, I think we women, because we are often the child rearers and bearers, see this more, that this connection between nature and us, and the natural forces are more stronger than we often recognize.
Yamuna, can you go ahead with your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Helen, for this great presentation. It's quite a theoretical and conceptual framework. And I think we were discussing with my colleague here about what you were presenting, and we feel like that this is something we are doing when we are working, you know, in villages, doing interventions for women and supporting them, understanding the different dynamic and system that keeps them, you know, in their home, these kind of things. But my question would be like, how do we really apply this feminist system thinking, like, to research? Because how does it work? You mentioned one of the principles of this system thinking, feminist system thinking, is a method. So I'm really wondering, what are the kind of method we can use to really do, like, is it only an inquiry, or is there different ways of looking at that? Because I read a bit about soft system thinking, like with different tools. So what are the tools that are out there to help us to kind of use this theoretical framework and conceptual like guidelines to actually read a situation and better understand what are the elements that can be lever factor for a change for women? I hope my question is
totally makes sense. This is where it gets a little bit weird, because she, as I said, reiterated twice, that she never saw it as a methodology. She saw it, or a method even. She just saw it as a guidelines, and she said the framework is loose. It's for you to interpret it how you feel. Now, that said, it was based on critical system thinking, which is really the sort of the system heuristics around boundary technique, etc., which again I mentioned is a great tool in terms of understanding marginalisation, but in a very hard way of seeing it. It literally, you know, it doesn't actually then pick apart the intersections of what's actually going on, and using more of the social sciences aspects of it. So for me, the fact that she's left it open to interpretation, the framework and how you do it, I think you can easily say, I'm going to employ some form of systemic inquiry around this, And you could then go into, I mean, there are like system dynamic work, whether it be Senge, Meadows, Sharma and that side of it, but the work they do in that more sort of conversational systems thinking approach, or even just setting up your own inquiry. I mean, one of the things I actually teach is systems thinking in practice, which actually asks you to set up your own form of inquiry in a way that you still fit. And as this is actually working with stakeholders and their voice should be part of this, one of the things we have to be sure of is that they understand what they're doing and they're part of the design. So the fact that she's left it open means that you can build on whatever you feel comfortable with and the participants do to create this. Because remember, systems thinking, although there's the academic application, it's asking us to think about the problem, but in a deep way, usually, and the best way to do that is through conversation. Yes, you need to do some research. Yes, you'll need to get some data together, but ultimately it is that. So I would say the framework, the parts of it is down to a conversation for starters. Which bits are you going to most concentrate on, which bits are you going to be at the least end of the framework, but what methods and tools you use has to come down to the people who are in the room. So, but some of them will be probably, for me, the obvious, like the art of hosting techniques, appreciative inquiry, action research and action learning, because this has got to be something that resonates with people, can be easily shared with those who are not academic practitioners, but most of all, generate conversations which are rich of information and insights into the problem.
I understand what you mean, and this is definitely quite interesting. I'm just wondering, because we are working with rural village women, so I'm wondering how this can be translated, you know, and how we can be intermediary for this kind of like for bringing this kind of concept to them. But I think it's really great information to have in mind, and like having these guidelines, you know, because I remember when I read about that, I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, there's actually a guideline on that. I was like, that's amazing. This is how I think. And actually there's somebody who put it as, you know, as a framework. It's out there. So I really love, you know, the philosophy behind and the values also behind this ecofeminism and this approach. Mm-hmm. And that's where I was wondering what are the kind of application of it and how we can directly use it, or kind of, you know, like that was the question. But thank you so much for your answer. I understand the point that it's a kind of, we have to kind of appropriate ourselves the guidelines, like this idea, and then see with it how we can work with the community or with the people that with this
I think in the chats there is the problem. One of the problems is, and someone said it's about the word feminism. So of the few people who've used it in their case study work, that was one of the first things they had to actually change, was that word, because the number, it didn't, the one of them was in Nicaragua and the word had political connotations there, so she dropped even using it for starters in that so in her piece of work. And the other issue was again, and this is probably a political thing, that the idea of the position of women in that particular society was very different from the Western position because of the politics around Sandinista government and women, blah, 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 blah. So she had to tailor the tools to the people she was working with, so it resonated with them. But the most important thing was the framework and making sure that all those aspects of the framework, because remember, one of them is choose your methodology as well. So the reason why it's loose is because you're going to have to choose those methodologies in relation to the context you're working in. And you should, like I said, and if the point of this is to get the understanding of how the people you're working with are situated, then they've got to be tools that they can work with. And, you know, that's why I said that there needs to be more, it needs to be more visual, because often the people we're going to be working with, women, are not going to always have a master's degree in systems work. They're going to need it to be more visual. So it could be scribing work to get them to draw and discuss. doing the 3 or 4D modeling with them as well to get the idea of the problem out. It's then for you, if you're the academic practitioner, to take that information, and then yes, you're probably going to use more robust methods to take that information, but when you're working on the ground with them, you need to always design it with them in mind, because at the end of the day, their voices need to come forward and come forth.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. And I think it's very important, this point you mentioned about the political load that is on this word feminist, because there's the common understanding of it is very westernized. And I think that's why also for India, there's a different perspective of feminism, and there's a very strong belief that women are equal to men, so they can't identify themselves with a feminist theologian and whatever the writers in the West. And there's this kind of post-colonial and also different approach to what is feminism for this nation, or even for when you were speaking also about indigenous. So yeah, definitely. And I think this is important, that this political load is not so much put on feminism, because then it's kind of going against what we also want to do, which means supporting women. And actually it's going against what we want to do when we use such words. So it's very important to have this in mind. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and sharing these wonderful guidelines. I think Reshma has her hand raised.
Yes, Reshma, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful talk, Helen. The thing is, as Yamuna rightly pointed out, these are the thoughts in our mind, but we never knew such guidelines existed, and we can actually put it into practice. But one question, while you were discussing the answer, you said that you'll have to make it really visually, specific for the context, that women can understand, where they need to focus, etc. But still, even if you do a participatory rural appraisal with them and find out what are the different problems that you can, find out in the context that they live, but still they're going to solve, or they're going to a higher, higher hierarchy, where the decisions are mainly done by either a men or a people who are, responsible for bringing up the other systems perspectives that we talk about. So how do we actually go ahead and convince them to stick on to their agenda, make things happen? How do we even convince women to actually move forward? That's my question.
Yes, a big question. And that's why I also said, do we need to come up with more frameworks for ourselves? But it is a big question, because this is the Western field of systems thinking, we have to stress that, is male dominated. The social systems and structures that we are trying to rectify for women are going to have a male slant to them. So that is the $1 million question, which I don't have a particular answer to, but I do feel that the practices that we do as women, and it comes back to the earlier answer, earlier question, which was about the groups that we form. Our voices are often lost, and the work we're doing is lost. So therefore, I think sometimes that they think that it's, like I said, it's just you doing your thing on the side. I think there needs to be more elevation. How we do that, I wouldn't want to say, of what we are doing in the background, because I think it's that often doesn't help, that it's often seen, our work is often seen as secondary rather than primary, and not in the same world. And something you also kind of touched upon as well is that, to what extent should we be trying to be applied? And it comes back to the last person's question, Sundari, other forms of systems thinking to this. And maybe that's where the thing comes in, as I said, should we be coming up with our own ways of doing systems? Because why would we want to apply check and sauce systems methodology to this when it came from an engineering background, and you're kind of shoehorning something that, if you've ever read his book, lovely though it is very male. Okay, so why would we want to apply that to it? And if we can come up with our own methods and ways, that if we can elevate our voices more to be seen that this is another way of doing it, so then it will be taken as seriously and have ways of applying it that work for us. And I think that's something we need to consider, is that and something I try to advocate is, if the system isn't working for us, then we need to create our own system, because systems thinking isn't always just about overlaying stuff, and we go on about leverage points, but that's just really sometimes just a sticking plaster. I think some of the answer to this is, how do we do it? And how do we make people who are particularly male take this on board? Is that we need to come up with our own ways of doing it, making sure it's elevated and seen on the same footage, which is not an easy ask. And I'm not saying I have any solutions to do it, but it's something we need to consider. And I'd say we shouldn't retrogradely think that we need to overlay this with what's already there.
I think that's a step forward that we need to keep in mind as well, while doing all our interventions in the field. Yeah, but thank you for the talk. It was really informative.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reshma. In fact, Helen, when Reshma was asking you that question, even following up with what Yamuna stressed on our work with villages and vulnerable communities, do you have any roadmap in mind, like some tools which we can use for effective community engagement, like picking up those vital elements of organization which can be the future parts of the system, and how we can organize, if the examples of or your own experiences from any field trips where it has worked, or what are the elements which can help the women overcome the resistance they already have in the certain aspects of life, and bring out the wonderful femininity that's inherent in them.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about I don't know why we do love a group work. Yesterday I had to do a thing about communities of practice, and I then wrote down how many different groups I sit on, and I didn't realize how many there were, and they're nearly all predominantly, but apart from one which has got a male on it, they're all women. And that's how we I don't know what it is, and I find doesn't matter where I go in the world, we do like to share our stories with one another. So a lot of my techniques I use within my practice, including with organization, are storytelling techniques to get stories out of people. And I usually use ways that suit them. So at the moment I'm working with an organization, and they're using a pictorial framework to get their stories out and understand how they see systems. So anything that's visual and gets a story out and gets people chatting, particularly with them, usually always works really, really, really well. But the main thing is, for me, is that when I work with people, particularly with groups, is I don't tell them I'm a systems thinker. I don't go there and tell them I'm going to do this, that, and the other methodology or theorist or anything else. I get them to tell me, what you ask that simple question, what's the problem you're facing? Tell me about it. And let's have that conversation and listen. It's that active and listening and learning that we don't do very well, but we need to, because that's how we miss out on what they're actually trying to tell us. And it's also, again, depending on where you come from the systems world, I very much believe in that you should always turn up with an open body, mind, heart, and soul. You are not there to pass judgment. You need to suspend your judgment, assumptions, presumptions about the situation, and actively listen to what they're saying and learn. Then you can go off and do whatever you want to do. As I said earlier, if you want to apply that to some methods or whatever. But when you're with these people you're working with, this is their space for them to open up and talk. And so any tools, and I really love, I don't know if you know the art of hosting techniques, things like World Cafe, which are all conversational, all of those. And you don't need to use those words with people. You just say, here, write down this is the question you've told me, let's have a discussion, let's all write this down and see what you all think, what resonates and comes up. And these simple techniques all work no matter where you are in the world, because people just like to share and get it off their chest and often aren't given that opportunity. So anything conversational, anything that allows people to share their voice is the way forward.
That's so nice to hear, Helen. In fact, a world which is transitioning from certain mold of thinking about women to the modern ways, it is indeed very important to have the right conversations. In fact, our conversation itself can go on for some long time, I say, but we have 5 minutes more, and we have to do a justice to Gauri Briggs. Hope you have read the chat, Helen. Uh, she's very kind and a wonderful pointer about the session. And there's also about an important point about indigenous cultures, if you want to address that.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was saying at the beginning, is that, unfortunately, 20% of the world is Western European. They control the voices of academia because they ultimately, what we understand as the modern university or schooling system, really came from that world, and particularly from the UK. But all these practices, and that's why I laugh about systems thinking, it is not new. It is something that indigenous cultures, people on the ground do all the time. They just don't have fancy words for it. It's not in a book. It is thinking, and we all think. We're all capable of thinking, and we're all capable of thinking in quite nuanced ways about problems and fixing them. And I just think that, it's nice that we've got more and more. I hate the word indigenous, to be honest, as well. That's another problematic word, but anyway, we won't go there. There are more and more practitioners who are not from the Western world coming forward. And in fact, one of my things for 2022 is to look at African philosophy and how that has impacted on systems thinking, particularly because in systems thinking, you read a lot of the books, they go on about Aristotle and Socrates and all that, but yet there were contemporary African philosophers at the same time that they were actually working with and drew from. And so therefore, if you really want to know, if you want to have a lineage, their voices need to come into it. So realistically, systems thinking is what we all do. We all know it. We just know it under different worlds and different guises. We just unfortunately put the academic Western practice up there, when in fact ours should be up there as well too.
Wonderful, Helen. We have to end the session at 5. There are two more minutes. I leave it to you if you want to leave us with some more nuggets of wonderful wisdom. And before I end up time, on behalf of everybody here, Helen, it's been such a wonderful session talking to you. You are such a warm person, and the points that you raised, we are already working on them. All of us here who are very focused on creating the impact in the lives of women, especially the vulnerable ones in the society, and that is what is the crux of our work. So the last 1.5 minutes also, Helen, I leave it to you for spraying around a little more wonderful fragments of your wisdom.
Oh, wow. How do I follow that? Thank you. That's just made my day. Thank you so much. Well, I can say is that, this has all touched you, but you're all doing it. And I think it's really, is to continue what you're doing in elevating women's voices, making sure that, if anything with this framework is actually that if you feel there's a way of working with women which works for you and works for them, I think it gives you license to do that. I think what makes this different from other methods of systems thinking, it makes you feel that, I have to doggedly stick to the way that this intervention works, blah, 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 blah. Whereas this, I think what is nice about it is that it is really focused on the people you're working with. Although she said it was for practitioners, I think that she's doing herself a disjustice. It is for all of us, and it works well for all of us because you can design it in a way that fits you. So I would just say thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your wonderful questions and for the fantastic organisation and hosting of this wonderful conference. And I say good evening to you. So thank you very, very, very much.